Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to David Makovsky.
Wow, thank you very much. I don't know where to start. I feel very much a product of St. Louis. I don't know if Bob Cohn's here, but he's right over there. He was my first mentor, and I started writing articles when I was 11 years old for the St. Louis Jewish Light. He gave me an opportunity, and it was I wanted to write about this Jewish baseball player named Richie Scheinblum in 1972, so maybe I was 12. And it was really a great moment. And when I think of all the different Jewish institutions, I really feel like I'm a product of the St. Louis Jewish community. I think of that I was a camp counselor here at Camp Bear. I think it was 3 summers, if I remember, from 1976 to 78. I went to the Epstein Hebrew Academy all the way through. Thank you. I went to Sher Tzedek Synagogue, where I was bar mitzvah. And I went to Young Israel congregation as well. And all the different institutions of St. Louis Jewry, I think, had an impact on my life. So it's for me, I've said this to you before, I sometimes feel like I'm in the East, to paraphrase Yehuda Halevi, but my heart's in the Midwest. So it's great to be back, and it's true, I am a fanatic Cardinals fan. And for me to, if I don't get a chance to help witness Middle East peace, but to go to the White House when the Cardinals are being received by the president, and then after the ceremony, and I have the picture to prove it here, to stand with Bill DeWitt, the president of the Cardinals, and my Uncle Alan, and hold the World Series trophy. This, I think, is the second best thing. I say, if it can't be the Mideast, it might as well be the Midwest. So it's an honor. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Lynn. And it was great to see Lynn's husband, Bud Whittles, who I played basketball with at the Central Agency Hebrew High School, also many, many moons ago. So anyway, and see familiar faces. And family, people knew my parents, and my dad is sorry that he couldn't be here with us. He's out of town, but I said I would convey the best wishes, and he's doing very well. Things are great. So anyway, where are we now? Let's cut to the chase. We talk about Iran. I know that, there's a lot of deep concern and anxiety, as there should be. This is probably one of the biggest challenges Israel has faced since 1948, and has to make some big decisions. Decisions that are sometimes called like Ben-Gurion-like decisions, because it has that sort of historic import. I would say that, let me begin by talking about what we just saw at the White House last week between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, because I think it's important that people, whatever your views are, and I'm not here on the partisanship, I have a hard enough time keeping up with Israelis and Arabs than to endorse candidates. But I think that what we saw was a convergence on some very important dimensions of this issue, but the gaps are not yet closed. That's, if I had to summarize it in a sentence, that's what I would say. Convergence on many issues, but gaps are not yet closed. Where's their convergence? Well, the convergence is more the president really moving towards the prime minister on some key points. One is when he said, this is about the American national interest. And I thought that was so important that he said that. This is not about special pleading for Israel, although Israel is the only country being threatened with its existence to be wiped off the map that keeps getting repeated over and over by Ayatollah Khamenei and President Ahmadinejad. But it's very important that the president put this in the right context, which he did, I thought, in his speech and in the interview with the Atlantic magazine. He basically made clear that Iran with a nuclear weapon is a threat to the United States, it's a threat to the world, because it'll create a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So you'll have the most dangerous countries that we've ever seen. You've had the most dangerous region that we know of, I should say. And if there's a Persian Shiite bomb, you could bet the Saudis, who are Sunni, very much against the Iranians and against the Shia, and are already supporting the Pakistani bomb, they're going to want their own bomb. And the Egyptians, which are broke for now, but they're going to want one too. They see themselves as a leader of the Arab world. The Turks aren't Arabs, but they're Sunnis. They see themselves as a regional power. They're going to want a nuclear weapon as well. So we're going to see a nuclear arms race in the most dangerous region, and that's going to make that region far more dangerous than it is today. And it's also important because what sort of proliferation, transfer of even dirty bomb technology could happen to a non-state actor like Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran. I had the opportunity to sit with foreign ministers from 2 Persian Gulf states in the last year, and both of them said to me, David, you know, if Iran gets a bomb, we're going to be held under its sway. And if people think the price of oil is high now, they said, wait till Iran is a bomb, they will dictate the price of oil to us in the Persian Gulf. So when you add all that together, you will see an emboldening of rejectionists, you will see an intimidation of moderates, and it's hard to escape the conclusion when you put it all together, it is a profound change in the balance of power for the Middle East, whether they push a bomb or not. Needless to say, for Israel, the only country actually threatened with its existence, Israel, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, does not want to live in the shadow of an Iranian bomb. So I think it was crucial that the president said what he said about this being an American national interest, because you're already starting to see articles, you know, saying, well, you know, there they go again, sort of thing, about as if American Jews are trying to goad the United States into a war. Nobody wants a war. Everyone wants this issue resolved peacefully. I think that is another point of convergence between the president and the prime minister, is a belief that we're hoping that sanctions work, and maybe there'll be some diplomacy to it. But the key is, I think the only chance of diplomacy to work is if it's backed with the sense of pressure on Iran, because they've had so many opportunities and they haven't taken it. But these are the toughest sanctions yet that Iran has ever faced. An oil cutoff by, you know, forget the United States, we don't sell oil, buy Iranian oil anyway, but the European Union does, and they're pledged to cut it off by July 1st. The rial, the Iranian currency, has been devalued by about 75% just in the last month, 6 weeks alone. I think in most countries in the world, when you see that sort of a devaluation, there are also profound political consequences too. They're not just economic consequences. There's rationing of oil. There's all sorts of things going on in Iran. But I think where the president and the prime minister converge also is not just in seeing this as there's a commonality that this is a threat to the world, but that sanctions need to be pushed. And if this could be resolved peacefully, everyone would be happier. Nobody would be happier than Israel. There's no Curtis LeMay in this story. Remember Curtis LeMay, the guy who firebombed Tokyo and when the carpet bombed Vietnam? There's no Curtis LeMay here. When you go to Israel, as often as I do, you talk to these people, they want it solved peacefully if possible. The question is if it's possible. So that's, I think, a second point of convergence. Another point of convergence is clearly the issue of the president saying we cannot contain an Iranian bomb. Now that's code word. You have to know the code. The code here is to say people like Zbigniew Brzezinski have been making an argument that says, you know, we live with the Soviet bombs. We live with the Iranian bombs too. We could contain them. But I would, you know, as much as I respect Professor Brzezinski, and I've been on some panels with him, I would respectfully disagree with him because there are a lot of differences between the Cold War and this situation. When there was a Cold War against the Soviet Union, there were 500,000 NATO troops as a bulwark in the middle of Europe. So there would be clear repercussions. There's no Middle Eastern NATO, it doesn't exist. And American troops that happened to be in the region because of Iraq for a different reason have already been pulled out anyway. So that's different. Another thing that's different is communication. In the Cold War, you had embassies. There was a Soviet embassy in Washington. Some of you remember Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador. There was an embassy in Moscow. Since the Cold War, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were hotlines in the White House and in the Kremlin. There's no such thing today. There's a U.S. interest section being manned by the Swiss. It's not an embassy. There's certainly no Israeli embassy, and there's certainly no hotlines. And by the way, in the case of Israel, there's, there's no communication at all. And by the way, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, you also had a sense that even with the communication, there was almost a miscalculation. If you read Robert McNamara's books, you see how even with communication, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were very much on the brink of a war. People weren't thinking about the depth charges of submarines off the coast of Cuba. And so when there's no communication, though, the prospects of miscalculation are even greater. As people say, well, also an obvious difference is the Ayatollahs were not the Soviet leaders. The Soviets were rational. The Ayatollahs, we don't know. Some would say messianists. They want to, bring about the hidden imam, the 12th imam, and maybe apocalypse isn't a threat. Maybe it's a promise. We don't know. But I would argue, even if you assume that they're rational doesn't mean reasonable. And the chances of miscalculation, even among rational people, like I said in the Soviet case, very high. So here would be much more. So you add all this together, and if this all wasn't enough in terms of difference, the triggers for conflict are different. You didn't have a Hezbollah proxy of the Soviets in the same way during the Cuban Missile Crisis or anything like that, or Hamas or anything like that. So you've got all these local triggers that make this much more complicated than the Soviet Union. And I would argue that's why it was very important that the president said, containment is not our policy. We are against it. We want to prevent Iran from getting a bomb, not just want to contain them once they have a bomb. So I thought that was an important statement. And those are areas. And then the final point I would say that was important was the president talking about Israel's sovereign right to defend its national security. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he came back to Israel, this is something that he focused on, saying this is what I wanted to establish, that we are the masters of our own fate, so to speak. And the president acknowledged that. And that's, I think, important, that even if there's a disagreement, that it emerges from the fact of mutual respect. And so you put all that on one side of the ledger and say, wow, there's some key points of convergence. And indeed, what's also been useful, I should say, because I know this weighs on everybody so much, is there's been unbelievable amounts of consultations between the U.S. and Israel. You'd have to be an air traffic controller to keep up with the number of announced visits. How many times do you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs going to Israel? How many times does the Chief of Staff of Israel come to America? According to press reports, the head of the Mossad was just here a few weeks ago. And Panetta, when he was the head of the CIA, he made many trips. Panetta's Secretary of Defense has made trips. And there's so many more trips, and that's only what's been announced. I can tell you there's so many things that are not announced. And above that, there's secure video conferencing that now exists that didn't exist in the olden days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you could be sitting in your office in the White House, and you'd be sitting in Jerusalem, and you're talking about Iran. No one's ever left the room. So I think, however this turns out, it won't be because there's been insufficient consultation, because they really have been very much in touch. So if you say if everything is so good, what could be bad? But I wanted you to hear some of the good news, because I know at these Jewish meetings, people, they're expected to get depressed. So if things are good, you feel like you've ruined their day. You told them good news. So I'm sorry if I ruined your day. But I think there is some good news there. Now, that's the good part. The part where the gaps have not been closed is the issues of timetables. And I said this on the NewsHour, it's not called Jim Lehrer anymore, just called the PBS NewsHour, is that the U.S. and Israel have different clocks, because the and it's by dint of the fact of different military capabilities. The United States is a superpower, so the U.S. can allow military action to wait longer and see if the sanctions kick in and are really, squeezing Iran in a very clear way. We can wait longer because we have more capabilities. Israel does not have the superpower capabilities, and so it is not able, it has a shorter timetable for decision. That's very important for you to remember. It's not about ideological differences, it's about differences over capabilities. For example, let's say there's something, there's something called, this is not, this is out in the public sphere, something in Politico, you read about it, it's called the MOP, Massive Ordnance Penetrator, 30,000-pound bomb. The only planes that could take that are B-2 and B-52. Israel doesn't have a B-2 or a B-52. These are like super bunker busters. Israel has a basic bunker buster. They don't have the larger bunker buster, but no one except the United States has a MOP. Now, there's some issues as it's being developed, but we shall see what happens there. But the point is the U.S. has more capabilities. Israel has got to make a tighter call because it doesn't have the luxury to wait and to see how long sanctions plays out. And we just don't know. Netanyahu, when he came back, said from the White House, he said it's not a matter of weeks, but it's not a matter of years. It's a matter of months. That has got people thinking, September, October, is this, before the U.S. elections, before the weather turns bad in Iraq, which makes things less predictable. We don't know, and also Israel wants to give the sanctions time to kick in. So we don't know. Maybe he's not going to, he's saying it because he's trying to pressure others. It's hard to read that. But I do think Israel is serious, and I think that basically I was just there recently, and it's clear that you have two people really leading the way on this, and that is, the defense minister, Ehud Barak. I'd say a step behind him is Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he has overall responsibilities. If things go wrong, it's on his shoulders. And then you have a lot of other cabinet ministers, and then you have the generals and the security establishment, and they have questions. Clearly, the first choice of the Israelis is this issue disappears. It's solved peacefully. They could all drink a l'chaim. They'd all be thrilled. Their second choice, I think, is that the United States deal with it because the U.S. has more capabilities, and this is not just an Israeli issue. But their fear is they're left with their third choice, that they are the ones that have to deal with it, and it could be even a fourth choice because they might have division within them. I was trying to understand Israeli decision-making more, and I started rereading all the whole Osirak literature, the literature of the attack on the 1981 Iraqi reactor. And what's fascinating there is that basically you had a determined prime minister in Menachem Begin, and he basically brought the whole system along with him. Ezer Weitzman had already just quit as defense minister over the Palestinian issue in May of 1980. The head of the Mossad, Yitzhak Chofi, he was against the strike. The head of military intelligence, Yoshua Sagi, was against the strike. There were others who were for it. Some of the ministers were for it. And basically, a determined prime minister, Begin, who was also defense minister at the time, taking the Weitzman portfolio during the first term. Sharon was the defense minister in the second term. Basically, he brought the whole cabinet with him, over the heads of the Mossad, over the heads of military intelligence. So if you see Meir Dagan on 60 Minutes and say, well, the head of the Mossad's against, there won't be a strike, remember that those divisions existed in 1981 too. And ultimately, it was the political leadership that made the call. In the case of Begin, it was really fascinating. He was really convinced that this would lead to a second Holocaust. It wasn't like today where you have this worldwide sanctions on Iraq. The French were selling a nuclear reactor, and at a very high level of uranium that was scandalous. There was really very little very little movement. Begin tried to get Yigal Yadin to support it. Yigal Yadin was then his junior coalition partner. And he was a noted archaeologist, Israel's first chief of staff at the age of 29, I think, in 1948. And by 1980, he said, look, if you go forward with this, I quit. And even though Begin brought most of the ministers together, and he didn't have to bring it to the full cabinet, but he said, I want to bring it to the full cabinet. I think as a moral matter, it should be brought to the full cabinet, not just the inner cabinet for security. He said, I have the majority, but I'm not going to do this until I bring Yigal along. And he delayed the attack. It turns out for 8 months, because he wanted Yadin on board. And he had the military intel people. He said, anything I see on intel on Iraq, show it to Yigal. I want him to see everything I see. By the end, Yigal Yadin not only didn't quit, he voted for the attack. So leadership meant bringing people along with you. And that's what Begin was able to do. Even it meant delaying the strike. So I think that, is something, to think about. I think that the concerns are not about whether Israel could actually hit it, but what can they reconstitute? Can Iran reconstitute the bomb easier after a strike? Will the international coalition of sanctions, basically just disappear? Because the strike is not the end, the strike is the beginning. You need to have an embargo on materiel so they don't reconstitute. The Israelis like to tell the story of these, and Amos Yadlin, who had an op-ed in the New York Times recently, was just a visiting fellow of my institute, will tell the story about the pilots when they went out there. And they met with Rafael Eitan, the chief of staff, and the youngest pilot, who was the last in the formation, who was tragically killed, named Ilan Ramon. And the Challenger, one of the space incidents in outer space, it was a terrible story. He brought a Torah scroll with him in outer space. He was the youngest pilot. And he was the one, after they hit the reactor, that the anti-aircraft fire of Iraq would go after. He said, Mr. Chief of Staff, we're risking our lives. How much do we set this Saddam Hussein guy back if we're successful? He said, maybe 2 years. He said, for that, I'm risking my life. He said, okay, maybe 3. But it turned out to be 10 until Desert Storm, and then 12 more years until Saddam Hussein himself was killed. So it ended up being 22 years when they thought it only might work for 2. So this is a case of where the Israeli system, they have a very different view than, let's say, Colin Powell, which is you bring overwhelming force, against a target and you get out. The Israeli doctrine sometimes seems more like Pirkei Avot, which is lo alecha mlacha ligmor, aval lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. You are not obligated to finish the work, but you cannot desist from starting it. So they see it that way. In America, we have a whole regional system. We want to keep these sanctions on them, and the United States, is concerned about how this thing is played out. Now, you could say, is it all policy? Is there a political element too? Could Netanyahu see 2012 as a year of opportunity, and does the president see it as a year of vulnerability? Because does he feel if he hits before an American election, whatever the opposition of the president might be, it'll be muted, while the Congress will enthusiastically support him. Now, a lot could be situational. If there's a lot of dead people and it's not successful, that could change things. But on the other hand, you could see political advisors of the president saying the more you talk about this, and you can't turn on CNBC television, the business channel, without people say, well, the price of oil is $30 above what it should be because of the possibility of an Israeli strike. And will this stifle off a recovery of gas prices and have political implications? Now, to be fair to the president, I don't think it's all about politics about 2012. I think he genuinely believes these are crippling sanctions, they're unprecedented, and give it a chance and we can solve this peacefully. Iran has got to back off. And we'll see if that's right. But it gets into these differences are about that Israel has a quicker window. Now, let me just explain a little bit, and I promise I won't go on too long on this. I'm not a nuclear physicist, but my understanding of why Israel is so concerned about this year. I think Ehud Barak went on CNN, and the first time an Israeli defense minister goes on American television and says there's a closing window, and we talk about the second half of 2012. Why? Because at a certain point, there's too many sites. It's just too hard to hit. And I think I just want to explain a little bit so you get a feel a little bit of what the issue is. Why does Israel have this window that's closing? The hardest part of making a nuclear bomb, to my understanding, is nuclear fuel. Of course, you need a missile, which the Iranians have. Of course, you need a warhead. There's been some articles in the Times lately about is their clandestine warhead program working or not. And but I think that people think it is or it isn't, but you might not know. But the nuclear fuel is something you can measure more because what's called the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has inspectors and has video cameras out there. And my understanding is Iran has enough what we call low-enriched uranium. That's the uranium you need for nuclear fuel, for reactor-grade fuel, enough for 4 bombs. According to Aviv Kochavi, who spoke publicly at the Herzliya conference. Aviv Kochavi is now head of Israeli military intelligence. It was a public speech he gave. But to have not just reactor-grade fuel, but weapons-grade fuel, you need to convert this low-enriched uranium, LEU, to HEU, high-enriched uranium. And the hardest part is to get to the low-enriched. To get to 20% takes a very long time. But to get from 20 to 93%, which is enough for a bomb, could happen only within a few months. And I think the fear is, certainly on the Israeli side, is we know they have enough low-enriched for 4 bombs. But in and of itself, this won't get them to a bomb. The Israeli fear is, will you be able to detect in real time when they convert? Because it's only a few months of that window. Some will say, well, there'll be cameras, and if they throw out the cameras, that's a casus belli. It's an act of war. So some say you'll know through the IAEA. Israel's fear is not just will you know in real time, but will you be able to act on what you know in real time? Will there be enough political oxygen in the room to actually act on your knowledge when it goes from 20 to 93% uranium? That's Israel's fear. That's what it comes down to, this issue of enrichment. Now, the Iranians have their main enrichment is a place called Natanz, where there's most of their centrifuges. That's what spins the enriched uranium and makes it more, makes it more enriched. And then there's another place, which is what's got everyone's attention right now, called Fordo. It's a mountain, 20 kilometers or so outside of the religious city of Qom, and it's 250 meters underground. And that place, Fordo, is the place that it's very hard to get to. They could spin, let's say, 3,000 centrifuges there. You could say the Iranians must have a sense of humor. They say it's all a civilian project, but if it's such a civilian project, why do they have to spin at high levels of uranium? And why 250 meters underground? And why inside a mountain? And why is it a site led by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards? It's a farce, obviously. So that's where the question of, can you get to it? If the bunker busters aren't strong enough to penetrate a mountain, what do? That's a really tough question. Some people say, well, Israel bombed the entrances and things like that. We'll see. But I think no one wants to bomb anybody. I think the goal is to try to solve it peacefully. But Israel's fear is if you slice it too thin, you might not know when they, like I say, convert from low enriched to high enriched in real time. And if you know, you won't be able to act on your knowledge and turn the international system around on a dime. It's not easy to do. So, yes, we don't know if they're doing a warhead or not. Some say they are, some say they're not. But the issue is, at what point can you not even get to their program because it's fortified, insulated inside a mountain? or it becomes so extensive that you would take all these casualties, or if you hit it at a certain point, it would lead to radiation to coming out and would have terrible implications for civilians. So the issue is not just about a warhead. The issue is how advanced is their program, and at what point can you stop it? At what point is what Barack likes to call the zone of immunity kicks in, and it is beyond your ability to attack, even though they don't have the bomb, but you can't attack it because the program is too advanced. And that's also for the United States, that our ability, even though it might be greater than Israel, we don't detect it in time. The nightmare is North Korea. The nightmare is Pakistan, which goes like too early, oops, too late. And that's the fear. Not that they're going to be able to push a button tomorrow morning, but your ability to hit that program is curtailed, and your window is shut. That's the fear. And the question is, what do you do? And that's the issue. Now, for the president, I think the key is, can you keep this coalition together in a way that's meaningful? And I tend to believe anything led by the United States would be more effective, because again, you can't just think about the strike. You've got to think of that the strike is the beginning, that you've got to hold the international community together, the people who are doing the sanctions, because you have to embargo the materiel so they don't reconstitute. That's the core. It's not enough just to strike. You got to strike and hold. And the fear is if Israel goes off alone, that, of course, the world always condemns Israel no matter what, but here it matters if they weaken the resolve on the sanctions, because they reconstitute faster. And you don't want to face this every few years. So this is the problem. Now, what I think we're going to see is next month there's going to be an effort at what they call the P5+1. That's the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the U.S., France, Britain, China, Russia, and the +1 is Germany, to sit with them and say, look, any 20% that you have, and they've got about half a bomb's worth of 20% right now, the Iranians, you've got to ship out of the country now. And the president sees it as an opportunity. And here's another difference. Netanyahu sees there could be value to diplomacy, because if the sanctions are biting, they need an avenue to back off. Diplomacy could be that venue. But he doesn't want to see a trap. He doesn't want to see that Iran tries to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel to give the U.S. just enough to make it sound the diplomacy might be having some effect, but really giving, doling out these concessions in such an incrementalist fashion that the only effort is to try to see the U.S. try to restrain Israel because the table looks promising. So this is why the diplomacy could be a threat. Now, I personally, though, think it could be an opportunity if the U.S. with its allies would come up with a single strategy and say, here, let's define what are our terms, and we're not going to allow the Iranians to drive this wedge. And if need be, though, this is Iran's last chance. We've given them chances, but the reason why we have an interest in giving them a last chance is because we want to be sure that we keep the international community on our side if there has to be a strike. But if it has to be a strike, it should be done by us, because we're the superpower and we're enforcing the regional order. There's been endless numbers of security violations, Security Council resolutions that they have violated. So, that's the thing. Israel's fear, though, is what I call the zone, is that Israel doesn't want to live outside of its window. It doesn't want to be, in a sense, dependent on the United States or any country to say, well, we've lost our window. Now we just got to say Tehillim, read Psalms, which is always a nice thing, but I'm not denigrating that. But we don't want to live in that world outside of our zone, that basically we have foregone an option to deal with an existential threat. If you look at the history of Zionism, it's about this ethos of self-reliance, that, when they said never again, after the Holocaust, it's that Israel does not outsource its security to third parties. And I always tell my students in graduate school and others that it's deep in the Israeli DNA that Israel does not want Americans dying for Israel. It believes that the fiber, the vitality of U.S.-Israel relations is that no American dies for Israel, is that Israel fights its own wars. So Israel, when Netanyahu says we want to be the master of our own fate, what he's saying is we don't want to live outside of the window. We don't want to be at a point where our options have slammed shut and now we just hope for the best. And therefore, I think that it's, this is key, that I think Israel would give the United States some time here to deal with the diplomacy. It will want to have a role in shaping the objectives of the diplomacy. The question is, would Israel give diplomacy time beyond its window? I think they will not. I think they'll say, look, fantastic if you're successful, and even if you fail within a certain timetable, but we cannot live by that outside timetable because we in Israel do not have your capabilities in Washington. That's the nub of the issue right there. Okay, so I hope you understand that's why this issue might be testing the U.S.-Israel relationship more than any other issue in my memory, because it's difficult. They're no easy calls. And I'll just say something. When you visit with these generals, what you see is that disproportionately, let's say compared to the diplomatic corps in Israel, and I was a correspondent over there for 11 years as the diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz and the editor of the Jerusalem Post. What you see there is that the generals you talk to, their parents or their grandparents or uncles or aunts are Holocaust survivors, disproportionately to any other part of the society. You get a conversation with them, it'll always turn up. More than if you talk to Israeli diplomats or journalists or artists or anyway. And I'm not claiming I did a scientific survey, but I've talked to a lot of them. And there's this iconic photo in their offices that you see at the Kiryat in Tel Aviv. They have a new, corporate-looking office at the Kiryat. And when you come into Tel Aviv off the Ayalon highway, you see this photo of an Israeli jet with the Magen David, with the Jewish star, flying over Auschwitz. And for them, that's for them what it's about. It's that they will, that they ultimately, their job is to make sure that it never happens again. I mean, I could tell you a story that, and you'll see how the story now relates in a minute, about the guy who ran this flyover. And this was his dream, he told me, from a young pilot. And in those days, still, the Iron Curtain hadn't fallen, but this was his dream, to do a flyover of Auschwitz. And people said, oh, you're crazy, this is never going to happen. And one day they got invited to an air show of the Polish Air Force. And so he said, this is my chance, and he got it all the way up the line, approved. And they said, great, and everything was all set. And then at the last minute, the Poles had second thoughts. They thought this was not good PR to have Israeli Air Force jets flying over Auschwitz. So I wonder why. And so there was a whole ceremony, and they said, no, we want you to fly at 40,000 feet. He said, 40,000 feet, no one's going to see us. And here the Israelis are Israelis in the classic sense. Only they could do this. The chutzpah, really. They said the air show is over. Once we finish this air flyover, we're flying back home. We just keep flying. And the only way this is going to work, because this is history, this is Jewish history, the only way this is going to work is that we turn off our radios. So we're not in touch with the Polish air traffic controllers as we fly over. So they fly over at about 1,500 feet. They swoop very low. They feel this is what they've been waiting for, and then they fly home, and they, I guess, turn on their air forces by the time, their radios after they leave Polish airspace. And the guy who organized that has just been nominated as the head of the Israeli Air Force. Amir Eshel. And he was the J5, he was the head of planning, in Israel, and now he's just been named about a month ago as the head of the Air Force. Amos Yadlin, like I said, who was a pilot who flew at Osirak, he was the head of Israeli military intelligence till 6 months ago, 9 months ago. So these people, it's very much in their minds. But it doesn't mean that they're so emotional that they're going to do it no matter what. These are people that are always thinking through what's good for the Israeli national interest. And I think Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, just brought a massive delegation to Israel. Didn't get a lot of play because I don't think they announced who was on the team publicly, but had excellent talks, interagency on the professional level. And I think, the Israelis are not having a pride of place that they feel they have to bomb Iran. I think they would like to see a peaceful way. And I think if they knew that the United States would lead that effort, they would do that. But they don't want to see us be in a situation that they have no options, that their whole ethos of self-reliance is out the window because they're beyond the window, that basically that Israel doesn't have any more options. So I think for them, it's not ideological that they feel they have to do this, but I think they're worried they're going to be left alone. So if you could tell them that this is now going to be led by the U.S. and that diplomacy will work within the window, I think they would turn over that baton willingly. But we'll have to see. And I think, it could be a situation. What if Israel's window closes, towards the end of 2012, but the American window is open for another year, and that the U.S. says keep the diplomacy going because it's working, because they're making concessions. This is going to test the U.S.-Israel relationship more than anything I can remember. So I'm sorry I threw a lot at you this evening, but it's really a complex issue, and it deals with so many different questions. And people say, well, are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? I get this all the time. Look, I am optimistic because, with all the rejectionists Israel has faced, and, it was striking that Netanyahu brought to President Obama a Megillat Esther, the story of the Iranians trying to kill the Jews 2,400 years ago. Like, what's changed? I think in a certain way, it's there have been all these Hamans of the past, and there have been modern-day rejectionists and Hezbollah, Hamas, and Ahmadinejad, and all these people. And a lesson of Jewish history is when your enemies say they want to kill you, you got to believe them. And that's a lesson that's branded into Israel. It's seared into Israel. But Israel is also cognizant that it's not enough to be right. It wants to be smart. And it wants a solution that is enduring and is not just for a few years. So if I had to sum it up, am I optimistic, not optimistic? I would say I'm optimistic because I see the resilience of the people in Israel. And I think ultimately Israel's will to live is greater than its enemies' will to die. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you all so very much.